Hey everybody, Mr. Murphy here. I'm going to talk about cellular respiration in its entirety. So with cellular respiration, I always start with the question of why do we breathe? And it turns out it's kind of a weird question that maybe you haven't thought about too much. I think some of the obvious answers are, well, we breathe because if we don't, we die. Or maybe because our cells need it, or maybe you get down to like, well, it's needed for cellular respiration. But what's interesting is that at the end of cellular respiration, we see where oxygen comes into play, and it's such a strange sounding use. But it is the only reason why we need to breathe in order to get oxygen. Now, there's a side benefit of breathing, which is getting rid of CO2, which is another thing related to cellular respiration. But it's an interesting question to sort of see the scientific answer for, just because I think it's something we take for granted. We've done it our entire lives. We have been breathing, and maybe we didn't give it too much thought. Here's a diagram of basically cellular respiration. We need to breathe. You can't really see it, but hidden behind me is a little pie that the kid needs to eat, and then we have those are the two things coming in. We need food and we need oxygen. And so here the food you can see represented with the chemical formula for glucose. We eat a lot of things and we get energy from a lot of things, but kind of an interesting fact is that your mitochondria just use glucose. So anything that we consume that's not glucose, it kind of supports what we've learned earlier about digestion. We have to break that down into its fundamental sugar forms. And we use a lot of different types of sugars in a lot of different ways, but our body also has ways of converting sugars that are not glucose into glucose, as well as converting things like proteins and fats into glucose in a pinch if it's needed. The things that are coming out, the products, are energy in the form of ATP. That is the goal of cellular respiration. We want to produce usable cellular energy. So the goal of photosynthesis was for plants or autotrophs to make their own food. In the case of cellular respiration, which plants also do, all living organisms do cellular respiration in some form. The purpose here is to actually turn that food into something that is immediately useful for the cell and its various processes. The other products are CO2, which is a waste product of respiration. Of course, we know that that's essential to photosynthesis. And we also produce water, which can be a little surprising as well, because obviously we need to drink a lot more water, which means that we're not producing enough for our bodies. But that's because water has so many uses inside of the body that even though it's a product of cellular respiration, we're not nearly efficient enough to just use what we've produced. There are plenty of desert evolved or desert adapted animals which certainly need far less water in their diet, but even in those cases of like tiny little desert mice and things that maybe never drink water, they're still relying on water contained within the seeds they're eating or things like that. So cellular respiration, while on paper gives you all the water that you maybe could need, the body uses water in such a variety of ways that it is not a sufficient amount. But it is still important to pay attention to because chemically that's what's being produced. And also we'll see then how in the larger scale of how respiration ties in with photosynthesis, it's essential that this process be recreating water that is then used in the process of photosynthesis. So similar to the last, or to looking at photosynthesis, I think it's good to start with like a big broad picture. And here we can see the three main phases of cellular respiration. We have glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And probably something we remember is that the electron transport chain, or the ETC, is where we are massively producing the ATP. That's where the bulk of sort of the benefit of cellular respiration actually comes from. That is contained, these two parts are contained within the mitochondria, and the electron transport chain is actually happening across the membrane of the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So the mitochondria has an outer membrane on the outside, and then maybe like the outside of this yellow part you could think of as a second membrane, and that's where the electron transport chain is actually occurring. The Krebs cycle is occurring in this yellow region, which we call the matrix. So looking at this process, just in terms of what's coming in, glucose and oxygen are coming in, and in terms of what's coming out, we're producing CO2, we're producing water, and then we're getting a ton of ATP. Starting with glycolysis, I like these diagrams from Khan Academy, I think they do a really good job of sort of thinning out all the extraneous information. This diagram still has some extra stuff. I don't need you to memorize the name of fructose 1,6-bisphosphate and to know that it's unstable, but rather just to understand that in the background there are chemical reactions that are reliable, that are yielding a net result of what is needed for the next step. And so in glycolysis, we take glucose, and a little fact that people always seem to remember, I think it really gets drilled in by earlier bio teachers, glycolysis requires energy right up front, which kind of seems backwards because the whole point of this is to liberate energy from the glucose. But of course, to destabilize glucose, which is a pretty stable molecule, we got to put some energy in order to start breaking things apart. And then we can trust the fact that we're going to get more energy out. So glucose gets broken down into 2 3-carbon molecules, and here we can see glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or G3P. I like to point out that this is exactly the opposite of that final step of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis takes 2 of these and makes glucose. Here we see glucose being broken back down into 2 of these. What follows is a process that we just have to kind of keep in the back of our heads, reminding ourselves that it's happening twice. Since 1 6-carbon glucose becomes 2 of these things, everything after this is going to be happening twice per glucose. So this glyceraldehyde phosphate is changed around and changed into pyruvate, which is what's going to be passed on to the next phase. And in doing that, we create 2 things. We create 2 more ATP, which is good. Remember, it's happening twice, so that means we've made 4 ATP, and we're making an NADH, which means since it's happened twice, we made 2 NADH. NADH and FADH2 are going to be the other energy-carrying molecules of cellular respiration. Very similar, or it's analogous to NADPH that we see in the process of photosynthesis. So just understand that as a energy-carrying molecule that we are charging up to use that energy down the road. And in fact, where that NADH comes into play is in the electron transport chain. There is a step between the between glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, which sometimes is like tacked on to the beginning of the Krebs cycle, but I just want to real quick go over it, which is the conversion of pyruvate into acetyl coenzyme A, or acetyl-CoA, which is, this is called pyruvate oxidation. Basically, it's just a prep step that needs to happen before the pyruvate can be changed into a form that can be fed into the Krebs cycle. So this is where we produce our first CO2. We chopped off one of the carbons here, and we attached this coenzyme A. And in doing that, we release the energy of the bonds associated with the C and the 2 oxygen molecules within the pyruvate. And we also, in using that energy, we charge up an NADH. So we make another one of our energy carriers. And remember, again, sorry to keep repeating myself, because this is a 3-carbon molecule, it's actually happening 2 times for every glucose that we take in. Here is the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. And here's that little step, that pyruvate oxidation shown on this one. I'm going to we can see lots of things happening and with nice little diagrams and things like that. But I'm going to jump over to this version from Khan Academy because, again, it thins out the details and helps us to just hone in on a little bit more of the important stuff. And the first thing that's happening is this acetyl-CoA is being fed into this cycle, is that these 2 carbons, that's all that's left. Remember, we lost a carbon dioxide. These 2 carbons are being attached on to an incoming 4-carbon molecule. That 4-carbon molecule, oxaloacetate, I don't need you to know the name, but it scoops up the acetyl-CoA, which adds on 2 carbons. The coenzyme A then leaves, so it's facilitating this, but then it goes away. And now we have a 6-carbon molecule. Where we go then is a series of energy liberating events, which are breaking off these different carbons into carbon dioxide. So we added 2 carbons here, and over the course of the next few steps, we're going to remove those 2 carbons in the form of CO2. So this is a high energy containing, this has a lot of free energy in it, and as it's being changed, that free energy is being released and converted into new forms. In this case, it's being converted into NADH is being produced here. So this is a redox reaction. There's an oxidation of the citrate and a reduction of NAD into NADH. And that's going to then have a byproduct of CO2. So that happens a couple times. And then we continue changing shapes around and breaking and altering bonds. We produce another energy carrier, FADH2. And before the end, we produce another NADH. One last time, a reminder that because this is the 2-carbon molecule that came from pyruvate, that means every glucose makes this happen twice. So if you were doing any sort of accounting of how many NADHs and FADH2s and things like that, you just have to double what you see on here. We also make a GTP, which is another energy carrier. We can think of it as synonymous with ATP, but it is meaningfully different. It's just level of detail that is beyond the scope of what we talk about. Just understand that it is functionally the same as ATP. It just has particular molecules that it is able to interact with that ATP perhaps cannot. That's the citric acid cycle. It is very much the opposite of the Calvin cycle from photosynthesis. The Calvin cycle was taking in these carbon dioxides and building them into larger molecules in order to produce a 3-carbon molecule to later be made into glucose. The last step is the electron transport chain, and the electron transport chain should look really familiar if you've recently looked at the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis, because it is precisely the same thing, just in reverse. Photosynthesis, we produced energy carriers from these high-energy electrons. Now we have our energy carriers dropping off high-energy electrons at this membrane, and these electrons are being bounced around and utilizing or allowing proteins to utilize their high energy to pump protons across the membrane. This time it's pumping protons out of the matrix and into the space between the mitochondria's two membranes. Just like with photosynthesis, this movement of hydrogens out is establishing a very significant gradient of hydrogen ions, where we have a ton of them here in the intermembranous space, which are then going to want to cross the membrane back into the matrix. Before we talk about that, though, these electrons need somewhere to go. And this is where we return to our earlier question, and we finish answering that question of why do we breathe? The oxygen that we breathe is solely there to serve as an acceptor for these electrons. These electrons that are being dropped off need somewhere to go. They're getting scooped up by oxygen, and that's also pulling away some of the hydrogens from this side, making the matrix even more lacking in hydrogen, even lower concentration of those hydrogen ions, and that's forming water. The very same water that could end up in a plant someday in photosynthesis, donating the electrons to begin the process again. If we were looking at the flow of these electrons go from water in photosynthesis to the NADPH to the glucose. Then the glucose gets consumed either in the mitochondria of that same plant or in the mitochondria of you or me, and is donating ultimately those electrons to these energy carriers, who then drop it off here, and it ends up back in the water. And then we breathe out that water molecule. It ends up in the root of a plant, and it's a whole complete cycle of the movement of these electrons through these two reactions. How do we get the ATP? That's an important question for cellular respiration. Because we have so much hydrogen ions here, or so many of them, they are looking to get across the membrane, and it's our friend ATP synthase right here doing the exact same job that it did in photosynthesis, except this time in the other direction of the movement. These hydrogen ions are now moving back into the matrix of the mitochondria, and by passing through that ATP synthase, they change its shape, enabling it to grab an ADP and a nearby phosphate group in order to make ATP. And so the process of cellular respiration relies upon the electron transport chain, because the electron transport chain is how we take all these energy carriers, the NADH and the FADH2, which we generated throughout the process during glycolysis, during pyruvate oxidation, during the citric acid cycle, and it takes all of those energy carriers to really just pump tons of protons across the membrane in order to ultimately produce a whole lot of ATP. And so one glucose molecule can yield something like 38 total ATP, the vast majority of which are taking place in the electron transport chain. But oxygen is needed. And as we know, there's a section from the book which talks a little bit about fermentation. In the case of fermentation, you ran out of oxygen. You're not able to do this as efficiently or as often as the body perhaps demands, and so then you don't have as much of this happening. You get a buildup of NADH, you get a buildup of FADH2. Your glycolysis and citric acid cycle maybe don't have enough NAD, they don't have enough FAD, and so the process starts to fall apart. And that's where fermentation can jump in. It's basically a way to keep glycolysis going, even though the rest of respiration isn't really keeping up. But I'll save the details of that for that other video. But this is where it would come into play, and hopefully that'll make sense as to how that is solving a problem. This diagram I really like, and it is showing you the connection of photosynthesis and respiration. So look over this and take some time with it and make sure it all makes sense. But I really like it because every single thing has both an arrow coming into it and an arrow going out of it, except for two things. The sunlight is the only input to the system, and the ATP produced at the end is the only output. In truth, it's the energy contained in the ATP, because this diagram doesn't show how the ATP changes into ADP, and that part of it still gets recycled. But the energy output is the loss, which ultimately is lost as heat. So these two processes together form this really tight-knit, perfect, balanced pair of reactions, where again the only input is sunlight and the only output is what happens with that energy, which ultimately gets lost as heat. So that is cellular respiration, and probably a good amount of photosynthesis as well. Hopefully between this video and the photosynthesis one, you've got a pretty good picture of how it works. Check out fermentation, and please do, as always, let me know if you have questions. Thanks.